Welcome to Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Excel but Were Afraid to Ask. This is Lesson 3, Logic and Formatting Functions. Here's what you'll need for this lesson. Microsoft Excel 2016 or newer, or Excel 365. This lesson's example files. Speakers or headphones. If you can't hear me, you're not learning everything I'm teaching. And ideally at least 2 monitors. Here's what we'll learn this week. Some worksheet basics. Some basic logic functions, if, COUNTIF, SUMIF. A couple of text functions, including len and CONCAT. And finally, how to prepare a spreadsheet for printing. In the previous lessons, we've only dealt with workbooks that have a single worksheet. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about managing multiple worksheets. Now, you'll remember from Lesson 1 that worksheet navigation is located in the bottom left corner of the workbook. You can add new worksheets by clicking the Insert Worksheet button. You can rename existing worksheets by double-clicking the tab or by right-clicking and selecting Rename from the context menu. You can also delete worksheets by right-clicking the tab and selecting Delete. And you can change the color of tabs to make certain ones stand out. We're going to work a lot more with multiple worksheets in some future lessons, but for now, let's dive into some logic functions. In the last lesson, we looked at some simple mathematical functions, but oftentimes your data analysis is more complex than that. That's where logic functions come in. Logic functions allow you to apply if-then logic to your analysis, to make your spreadsheets more intelligent, and to enable deeper and more granular analysis. The first function we're going to dive into is the if function. The if function is a building block. Once you master it, you'll be amazed at all the functionality you'll be able to unlock. We use the if function to test a condition or value. The syntax is if, logical test, value if true, value if false. So to show off all of these logic functions we're about to cover, I've created this simple sales log. This is just a list of some fake sales of cars and some details. This is just to give us some data to play with. Starting off with the if function, we're able to write a formula to test a condition. So, for example, we want to know for each of these sales, we want to know, is this a blue car? Okay, so the way we do this, as I mentioned, is equals if. Then we need a logical test. So in this case, the logical test is going to be whether this cell equals blue. Note that blue, because it's a text string, has to be in double quotes. If it does equal blue, we're going to say, yep, it's blue. And if it's not blue, we're going to say, nope. Frowny face. And again, notice you're able to specify a value for if the condition is true, and a value for if the condition is false. And both of those values, if they're text strings, do have to be also enclosed in double quotes. So obviously for this first car, it's going to return, yeah, it's blue. And we're going to drag this formula down so that it applies to all of these rows. And you can see it tells us whether the car sold in this transaction was blue or not. Now you can also use non-text conditions, numerical conditions. So for this example, we're going to look at whether this car is older than 2014. So to do that again, the function syntax is the same. We're going to say equals if, and then our logical test. In this case, we want to know whether the model year is less than 2014. And then we need to specify the value if that's true. So in this case, we're going to say yes. We're going to say older. And if not, we're going to say newer. So again, you can see that this first car meets the condition. It is older. Anything that is newer than 2014, that's going to come back as newer. And it's important to note that because the test is less than, things that are 2014 are going to come back as newer. If you wanted to include 2014 models in the older column, you would have to do less than or equal to. You can put both signs in there. And that'll convert all of the 2014 ones to older. Building on the count function we used in the last lesson, we have the COUNTIF function. We use the COUNTIF function to count the number of cells within a range that meet a certain criteria or condition. And the syntax is COUNTIF range criteria. So for COUNTIF, we're going to be counting the number of rows or the number of cells within our little sales log here that meet a specific condition. In this case, basically what I've set up is we want to know the number of sales made on each date between 4/16 and 4/24. So the way we do that is equals COUNTIF the range, and we're going to make sure to make that a absolute reference. And then the criteria, and that's going to be a relative reference to this date. So now we can see there were 3 sales on the 16th and 5 on the 19th. And you notice because the range is an absolute reference, that doesn't shift at all as we move down this column. But the date, the criteria, is a relative reference, and that'll move right down along with us the way we want it to. Sometimes one condition isn't enough. In that case, we use the COUNTIFS function with an S. We use the COUNTIFS function to count the number of cells within a range that meets a set of conditions or criteria. The syntax for that is equals COUNTIFS criteria range 1, criteria 1. criteria range 2, criteria 2, and so on. You can test up to 127 conditions. So with COUNTIFs, we're going to look at the same data, but we're going to take a slightly different approach. We want to know all of the sales that meet more than one criteria. So in this case, we're going to look at not just the date that the sales took place on, but the color of the vehicle as listed in the sales log. So to do this, we type equals COUNTIFS. Criteria range 1. So that's the range where we can find the first test we're going to do. That's going to be still this date column. And then criteria 1. That's the date. Now, because we're going to be doing this formula across 2 columns, we're actually going to just make sure that this is a fixed reference on the column. We want to make sure that we stay in column M even when we drag this function over one column. Next, we enter criteria range 2. So we're looking for colors here. So that's going to be this column right here. And then criteria 2. Now I could type red in here, but because I want to reuse this formula, I'm actually just going to reference it right here at the top of the column. And that, again, is going to need to be a mixed reference, but we want to keep it in row 3, but still move from column to column. And you can see here on the screen, it would allow me to continue typing more criteria and more criteria as needed for my analysis. But 2 is good enough for now. We didn't sell any red cars on 4/16, it seems. But we did sell one blue car. And so you can see that we're counting based on both criteria now. Next up, building on the sum function we learned last time, is the SUMIF function. We use the SUMIF function to add cells specified by a given condition. The syntax is equals SUMIF, range, criteria, sum range. You can omit the sum range argument if the criteria range contains the values you want to add. The SUMIF function is very similar in syntax to the COUNTIF function that we did a couple slides ago. Basically, what we want to look at now, before we looked at the number of sales that happened on a particular date, we're going to use the same data, but this time we actually just want to know the total dollar amount of the sales. So we're not counting, we're adding values together. So the way this works is equals SUMIF. Again, we need the range. So this is our criteria range, which is still the date column. And then our criteria, which is still the date. And then the sum range, that's the column that we want to add together. So what this is going to do is, for all the values where the date is 4/16, so this guy and these down here, it's going to find the corresponding row in this range and add those values together. And there you have it. Big sales day on the 19th. We use the SUMIFS function to add cells specified by a set of criteria or conditions. The syntax is equals SUMIF, sum range, criteria range 1, criteria range 2, etc. The SUMIFS function is going to allow us to break down the data even more granularly. So now we're not just going to look at sales by date. We're going to break it down by the make of the car. The syntax for SUMIFS is equals SUMIFS. Our sum range. Now, this differs from the SUMIF function we did a few moments ago, because here we're specifying the sum range first. In SUMIF, we specify it last. So that's an important difference to note. And remember, you've got your tooltip here, and that'll help you. So we have our sum range. And we have the range for our first criterion. That's going to be the date again. And then we have our first criterion. That's going to be right here. And then we have our second criteria range, which in this case is going to be the car make. And then our second criteria, that's going to be the column header up here. Now we're going to copy this formula to all of these cells. Again, add some formatting just so it's actually readable. And you can see the day-by-day sales for these two different car makes. Now, the great thing about referencing these car makes from the column header here, rather than typing them into the formula, is that you can change it dynamically. So if I decide I don't want to focus on Ford anymore, I want to focus on Toyota, I just type in Toyota, and the numbers change accordingly. Not everything you deal with in a spreadsheet will be numerical values. Sometimes you'll need to manipulate, interpret, or analyze text data. That's where the text functions come in. Text functions allow you to analyze, sanitize, and manipulate data. Now, we could do a whole lesson or several lessons on text functions, and we probably will at some point. But today, we're just going to introduce a couple of really simple, handy ones. Before we jump into those, I just want to remind you that these are building blocks for the complex analysis you'll be doing later on. Don't worry too much if they don't seem super useful or important yet. Trust me, they will. First up, we have the CONCAT function. The CONCAT function concatenates or joins together a list or range of text strings. The syntax is equals concat string 1, string 2, etc., or concat and then a range. And it's important to note the concat function replaces the older concatenate function, which works roughly the same way, but it didn't have the range option. So for our text functions, I've taken a list of the last 4 years worth of Best Actor and Best Actress nominees. Just a little data source to use here. And we've got their first name in column A, their last name in column B. And we're going to put those together using the concat function that we just learned. So the syntax here is equals concat. Notice the old concatenate function is down there. We're not using that. We're using concat. Now the concat function allows you to select multiple text strings to concatenate, but it also allows you to select a range to concatenate. Now, as you saw in both of those cases, we have a slight problem here because this is a name and you would kind of expect to see a space in between the first and last names. So what we're going to do is select the first name, and then we're going to add in a space as the second text string. So that's a double quote, space, another double quote. And then we'll add the last name as the third text string rather than the second one. And that's going to solve the problem. And there we have a list of all our Best Actor and Best Actress Oscar nominees from the past 3 years. Next up, we have the len function. The len function returns the number of characters in a text string. This is going to come in super handy a few lessons down the line when we're building complex functions for text manipulation and analysis. The syntax is equals len and the string. Now we're going to use the data we created in the last example to try out the len function. So the way the len function works is, it's very simple. It takes one input and it returns the length of the text string. Syntax is equals len and then a text string. We can copy that down, and then if we wanted to, we could even find out which actor or actress had the longest name in the last few years. Scarlett Johansson, ScarJo. And finally, the new TEXTJOIN function. The TEXTJOIN function concatenates a list or range of values using a delimiter. The syntax is equals TEXTJOIN, delimiter, ignore empty, string 1, string 2, etc. Now note, this is a newer function. If you're not on Excel 2019 or Excel 365, this isn't going to work. So make sure you know the compatibility needs of your workbook before using this. If it needs to be distributed outside your department or organization, you'll need to make sure everyone is using the latest versions of Excel. To use the TEXTJOIN function, I've given you my shopping list from this week to demonstrate how we can take a list in this format and make it into a delimited list. So the syntax is TEXTJOIN. The first input is a delimiter. So a delimiter is just something that separates a list. In this case, between every entry in the list, I'm going to use a comma and a space. And note, because this is a text string, once again, it's enclosed in double quotes. So that's my delimiter. Then a true or false value for whether or not I want to ignore empty cells. I usually use true unless whatever data I'm trying to format something for doesn't want to ignore empties. And then I can enter either individual entries, or I can do what I'm going to do, which is use a range. F3 through F16. And this will return a nice delimited list with all of my groceries that I can then copy and paste into a text message and say, don't forget to buy these things. In all seriousness, one of the really useful applications of TEXTJOIN I've found is if you're dealing with email marketing lists. A lot of times when you import your data into Constant Contact or MailChimp or anything like that, you need comma separated email addresses. And I know I've seen people go through by hand and make those comma separated email lists. So this would allow you to very quickly and easily create a comma separated list with a simple Excel function. Finally, while we live in a fairly digital society these days, sometimes there's no substitute for good old-fashioned ink and paper. If you need to print your worksheets, there are a couple important steps to follow to avoid frustration and mistakes. Now we're going to go over each step in turn. The first step is setting the print area, adjusting page breaks, adjusting margins and scaling, adding headers and footers, and some additional sheet settings. Now we're ready to prepare our spreadsheet for printing. So when you're preparing your spreadsheet for printing, the first thing you want to do is select your print area. That's appropriately the area of the spreadsheet that you want to print. We've got all kinds of stuff here, all kinds of columns. We don't want all of it printing. Some of it's just for us, and some of it is to print and bring to a meeting. So we're just going to print these first 15 rows, 14 rows of data here. That's going to be our print area. So the way you set your print area is you go to the Page Layout tab, and there's a Print Area button with a little drop down, and you're going to select Set Print Area. Now once you've set your print area, you will see there's like a little very, very light gray line around it. You can't quite see it. And once you've set your print area, you might decide you want to add additional rows. I'm skipping over Lady Gaga here, but I'm going to add just a couple rows down here. I can do that again by clicking the Print Area button and selecting Add to Print Area. And of course, if you screwed up, you can always start over and clear your print area. Now that we have our print area, we're ready to look at the page break preview and adjust any pagination. So down here in the bottom sector of our workbook, we have our different view buttons that we talked about in lesson 1. And all the way on the right, that's our page break preview. So we're going to go ahead and click that. And that's going to bring up a preview of our page breaks. Now you'll see a dark blue line surrounding the print area. And you'll see another line here, a little bit lighter line here, and that indicates where your pages are, your different page breaks. And then a little gray watermark indicating what's on each page. Now from this, you can actually adjust all of these things. So maybe I've changed my mind and I do want to include Lady Gaga here. I can just click on this and drag it down and add her to my print area. I can also say, you know what, this is crazy. I don't need 3 pages. Let me just move this page break and just print it all on one page. Once you've adjusted the pagination, you can go ahead and set your margins and scale. So there's actually a margins button right here on the page layout tab, but I like to go into the full page setup dialog box. So you can do that by clicking the little icon in the bottom right corner of the page setup group on the page layout tab. And there's 4 tabs here. The first one that we're going to look at is margins. Now, you can set the margin on each side of your spreadsheet for when it prints. I like slimmer margins here, and you can tab between these different boxes to set them. This page also allows you to set whether your data is centered on the page. So you can see it is currently not centered on the page. But if I select those boxes, then it is centered on the page. Once I've set my margins, it's time to look at page scaling. So you saw in that print preview there that I had a few rows of data. It was centered on the page, but maybe, it wasn't taking up the whole page. Maybe I want it to be a little bit bigger. I can automatically adjust the size of it here on the page tab within the page setup dialog, right here in the scaling group. So I can adjust that. Right now it's already 130% to normal size, but I can set that to 170, play around with that and see whether that looks good. That's better. Or I can go ahead and just tell it to fit to a certain number of pages. So in this case, I want it to fit to 1 by 1, and it'll make sure to scale it to fill that many pages. Next up, still in the page setup dialog box, we have the header and footer settings. So Excel has some built-in default options for you here. You can choose to have no headers. You can just throw a page number in there if you want, or some other things that are defaults. This is the tab number, or tab name rather. There's your file location, your author name, and your page number. There's a bunch of different options there, but you can also specify a custom header. And that's just going to allow you to write whatever you want in the left, center, and right sections. And these buttons in here, they allow you to insert different properties. So I want the worksheet name, or the tab name, and now that'll show up in the middle when I set that up. The footer works the same way. You've got some options here that are built in, and you've also got the ability to create a custom footer. And you can see the custom header that I created and the default footer I used. Last but not least, there are a couple of other sheet settings that are worth mentioning. Basically, starting with the print titles area, this allows you, if you've got a spreadsheet that spans multiple pages, to repeat the title row on every page. So here I have chosen to repeat rows 1 and 2 on every single page. And I also want to repeat these columns, A and B, on every page, if they're within the print area. You can also choose to print grid lines. Now, normally when I want grid lines, I just add a cell border, but you do have the option to click the Include Grid Lines section, and it'll show that if there's no cell border. If there's a cell border, it's still going to show the custom borders that you added. And you can also print your row and column headings. That's your A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4 down the side. Normally, this is not something you do. It can be handy for certain usage. For example, if you want people that are reading your document to be able to reference those values. And finally, you can choose whether your document will print portrait or landscape. For large, wide things, usually certain types of reports, you may want to go to landscape. Let's recap what we've learned. We covered some worksheet basics. We learned some new logic functions, including if, COUNTIF and COUNTIFs, SUMIF and SUMIFS. We did some text functions, including len, CONCAT, and TEXTJOIN. And we covered how to prepare a spreadsheet for printing. That's it for this lesson. Join us next time.